The first thing Americans need to understand is that an economy does not break all at once. It breaks in layers. It breaks when energy prices rise faster than wages. It breaks when food costs climb while officials tell people inflation is under control. It breaks when families use credit cards not for luxury but for survival. And it breaks when a government launches or supports a dangerous military confrontation without explaining to its own people how the economic shock will come home. That is what we are looking at now. The Iran war is not only a military crisis, it is becoming an economic crisis, a household crisis, and a national security crisis inside the United States itself. Most people are being told to look at the headline inflation number and stay calm. That is the first mistake. Headline numbers are designed to summarize, they are not designed to explain pain. They do not show you the family standing in a grocery aisle putting items back because the total is too high. They do not show you the worker whose commute just became more expensive. They do not show you the elderly person deciding whether to pay the heating bill or reduce food spending. And they do not show you how war driven energy shocks move quietly through every part of the economy until the public begins to feel a crisis that policymakers pretend is manageable. If the reported April inflation data is accurate, the direction is not hard to read. Inflation is not cooling in the sectors that matter most to ordinary Americans. Energy is rising, food is rising, electricity is rising, real wages are under pressure, household debt is expanding, delinquencies are already near troubling levels before the full force of the latest energy and grocery shock even shows up in the data. That means the danger is not behind us. The danger is still moving through the system. Stay with this because the next layer is where the official story begins to fall apart. Inflation is not just an economic statistic. In wartime, inflation becomes an intelligence indicator. It tells you whether the country can sustain the policy its leaders have chosen. It tells you whether domestic life can absorb foreign policy decisions. It tells you whether the cost of military action is being paid honestly or hidden inside fuel bills, grocery bills, credit card balances, and state budget pressures. And right now, the indicators are flashing red. Energy is the center of this problem. You cannot understand the economic impact of the Iran crisis without understanding energy. Oil is not just oil, oil is transport. Oil is food production, oil is shipping, oil is fertilizer, oil is plastics, oil is aviation, oil is heating. Oil is the bloodstream of modern economic life. When a war threatens supply routes, refinery stability, shipping insurance, tanker traffic, and regional energy infrastructure, the shock does not remain in the Persian Gulf. It moves into American households. That is why rising gasoline prices matter so much. A family cannot simply stop driving because Washington made a foreign policy mistake. Workers still need to go to work. Parents still need to take children to school. Small businesses still need deliveries. Farmers still need diesel. Truckers still need fuel. Airlines still need jet fuel. The economy does not pause because politicians decide that a conflict is strategically necessary. The bill arrives anyway, and this is the point that mainstream commentary often misses. The government may call inflation temporary, manageable, or contained, but the household budget does not use those words. The household budget uses dollars. It measures whether the paycheck lasts until the end of the month. It measures whether a family carries a balance on the credit card. It measures whether a worker skips a medical appointment, delays a car repair, or buys cheaper food. That is the real economy, not the press conference economy, not the Wall Street economy, the real economy. But if you think that was the dangerous part, what comes next is even more serious. The energy shock does not stay in the gas tank, it moves into food. Every stage of food production depends on energy. Fertilizer production depends on natural gas and global commodity flows. Farm machinery uses fuel. Processing plants use electricity. Refrigeration uses power. Trucks move food across long distances. Stores pay higher operating costs. When energy rises, food eventually follows. That is not politics, that is physics and logistics. So when grocery prices jump, do not treat that as a separate story. It is part of the same chain. A war that disrupts energy markets becomes a grocery problem. A grocery problem becomes a household debt problem. A household debt problem becomes a banking and credit problem. A credit problem becomes a political problem. And If it continues long enough, it becomes a national stability problem. This is how bad foreign policy comes home. It does not always come home as body bags or dramatic battlefield footage. Sometimes it comes home as a heating bill. Sometimes it comes home as a higher grocery receipt. Sometimes it comes home as a worker who receives a raise and still becomes poorer because inflation ate the raise before it reached the bank account. That is the silent cost of reckless policy. Now, let us talk about wages. If nominal wages rise but real wages fall, that means people are running harder and losing ground. That is one of the most politically dangerous conditions in any society. People are told the economy is strong, but they feel weaker. They are told wages are up, but the paycheck buys less. They are told inflation is under control, but their food, fuel, and electricity costs say otherwise. That gap between official narrative and lived reality is where public trust begins to collapse. And once trust collapses, leaders lose the ability to guide the population through crisis. That is a national security issue. A country cannot sustain major foreign policy commitments if its own population believes the government is lying about the domestic cost. You cannot tell people to sacrifice for a strategy if you refuse to explain what the strategy is. You cannot ask workers to absorb energy shocks if you have no end game for the war creating those shocks. You cannot build resilience on deception. And this is where the intelligence picture becomes much darker. The data that has already been reported may only be the beginning. Household debt numbers often lag behind the real stress. Delinquency data tells you what happened after families tried to hold on. Before a person misses a payment, they usually cut spending. Then they borrow. Then they delay. Then they use savings if they have any. Then they choose which bill not to pay. By the time delinquency shows up clearly in the data, the household has already been under pressure for months. That means if debt is rising now and real wages are falling now and food and energy are rising now, then future delinquency pressure is already being created. It is not hypothetical, it is already moving through the system. Credit card balances are not just numbers, they are signs that millions of people are bridging the gap between income and cost with borrowed money. That is not prosperity. That is financial exhaustion. I have seen this pattern in countries under sanctions, under war pressure, under debt stress, and under political mismanagement. Governments keep talking until the numbers stop cooperating. They keep insisting the situation is stable until the public feels the instability every day. They keep saying the crisis is external, temporary, or manageable, while the internal economic foundation begins to weaken. That is what serious analysts watch, not speeches, not slogans, not campaign claims, the foundation. The foundation of American economic strength has always been the household. If the household is strong, the country can absorb shocks. If the household is weak, every shock becomes more dangerous. And right now, many American households are not strong. They are stretched. They are indebted. They are paying more for essentials. They are using credit to survive. They are seeing real income pressure. That is not a healthy foundation for a foreign policy built on escalation. By the end, you will understand why this is not just about inflation or gasoline. It is about credibility, deterrence, and the failure of strategic judgment. A government that cannot calculate the economic consequences of war cannot be trusted to manage escalation. A government that hides the household cost of policy decisions cannot be trusted to tell the public the truth. And a government that confuses military action with strategy will eventually discover that the battlefield is not the only place where defeat can happen. Now, let us look at the political claim that tax refunds or small household offsets can rescue the situation. This is the kind of arithmetic that works in a briefing room and fails in a kitchen. If a family receives a slightly larger refund, but gasoline, heating fuel, groceries, electricity, insurance, rent, and debt payments all rise, that family is not rescued. It is temporarily distracted. A one-time or modest monthly benefit cannot offset structural cost increases in essentials. Essentials are not optional. You do not negotiate with the price of fuel when you must drive. You do not negotiate with the grocery shelf when children need food. You pay or you go without, and the public notices who gets real relief. If households receive small offsets while corporations receive much larger advantages, the political message is clear whether officials admit it or not. Working people are told to endure. Large institutions are protected. That is not a sustainable social contract. It breeds anger. It breeds cynicism. It breeds the belief that the government serves one class while speaking in the name of another. This matters because economic pain in wartime changes politics quickly. The public may tolerate foreign policy adventurism when the cost feels distant, but when the cost arrives at the pump, the grocery store, and the utility bill, patience disappears. Suddenly, people ask basic questions. Why are we involved? What is the objective? How long will this last? Who benefits? Who pays? And if the government cannot answer those questions clearly, the legitimacy of the policy erodes. The Iran war, or any major escalation with Iran, carries exactly that danger. Iran is not a small, isolated problem that can be bombed without consequence. Iran sits near critical energy routes. It has missile capabilities. It has regional partners. It can threaten shipping, bases, infrastructure, and markets. Even when it does not directly shut everything down, the risk premium alone can raise costs. Insurance rises, shipping patterns change, energy traders price danger, refiners adjust, markets move before politicians finish talking. That is how the economic battlefield works. Washington keeps making the same mistake. It assumes military power can control political and economic consequences. It cannot. Aircraft carriers do not control oil prices. Bombers do not stabilize grocery bills. Sanctions do not make supply chains more resilient. Threats do not lower fuel costs. Once a conflict threatens the structure of global energy flows, the civilian economy becomes part of the battlefield, whether leaders admit it or not. That is why the Federal Reserve conversation is incomplete. People ask whether the Fed should raise rates, lower rates, pause, or signal patience. That discussion matters, but it does not solve a war driven supply shock. If inflation is rising because demand is too strong, interest rates can cool demand. But if prices are rising because energy supply is disrupted, shipping is more expensive, fertilizer is strained, and geopolitical risk is priced into commodities, then rate hikes become a blunt instrument. They can slow the economy, but they cannot create oil. They can pressure borrowers, but they cannot reopen secure shipping lanes. They can reduce spending, but they cannot fix a strategic mistake. This is the problem of using monetary policy to clean up foreign policy failure. The Fed can influence credit conditions. It cannot provide a coherent Middle East strategy. It cannot end a war. It cannot rebuild trust with producers. It cannot make Iran disappear from the map. It cannot remove risk from the Strait of Hormuz. So, if the government creates an inflationary shock through military escalation, then asks the central bank to clean it up, the public pays twice, once through higher prices and again through tighter credit. And fiscal dominance makes this worse. When government debt and deficits are already enormous, interest rate policy becomes more constrained. Higher rates increase borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs worsen the fiscal position. A weaker fiscal position limits policy flexibility. That means the state becomes trapped between inflation and debt service. This is not just an economic theory, it is a strategic vulnerability. A country carrying heavy debt cannot wage open ended foreign policy adventures without consequences. This is where American power is being misread by its own leadership. The United States is still powerful. It still has the world's reserve currency. It still has a massive military. It still has deep capital markets. It still has technological advantages, but power is not immunity. A country can be powerful and still make itself weaker through bad decisions. A country can dominate militarily and still damage its economy. A country can win tactical exchanges and still lose strategic position if the cost of action exceeds the value of the objective. That is what serious military analysis must ask. What is the objective and is the cost acceptable? If the objective is to pressure Iran, what is the end state? Regime change, nuclear rollback, regional containment, protection of Israel, control of energy routes, deterrence restoration. These are different objectives. They require different policies. If Washington cannot define which one it is pursuing, then it cannot calculate the cost. And if it cannot calculate the cost, it has no strategy. The public is being asked to absorb consequences for a strategy that has not been honestly explained. That is unacceptable. War requires accounting, not only accounting of bombs and troops, but accounting of fuel, food, debt, wages, and social stability. The civilian economy is the rear area of any great power. If the rear area weakens, the military policy becomes harder to sustain. Now consider household debt in that context. When families borrow to cover essentials, they are not building wealth. They are delaying crisis. Credit card debt is expensive debt. Auto debt can trap households in payments they cannot easily escape. Student debt burdens workers who are already facing high housing and food costs. Mortgages are affected by interest rates. Renters face indirect pressure when financing costs and insurance rise. This is not one isolated stress point, it is a web of stress points. And when delinquencies begin to rise, banks tighten. Credit becomes harder. Families lose flexibility. Small businesses feel reduced demand. State governments face pressure as social needs rise and tax receipts become less predictable. This is how household pain becomes institutional pain. It starts with families and moves upward, but policymakers often see it too late because they look at lagging indicators. They look at employment numbers and say the economy is strong. They look at aggregate consumption and say consumers are resilient. They look at headline inflation and say the situation is manageable, but resilience can be exhaustion in disguise. Consumers can keep spending by borrowing. Employment can remain stable while real wages fall. Headline inflation can hide essential cost inflation. If analysts do not look beneath the surface, they will miss the turn until it is already underway. That is the same mistake governments make in war. They count aircraft, ships, missiles, and casualties, but they miss morale, logistics, industrial capacity, political will, and economic endurance. Then they are surprised when the war does not behave according to the model. Economic policy is the same. If you look only at the headline number, you miss the human terrain. The human terrain in America is strained. Lower income communities are hit harder because they spend a larger share of income on essentials. Rural communities are hit harder because driving is unavoidable. Older households are hit harder because fixed incomes do not adjust fast enough. Working families are hit harder because childcare, food, fuel, and rent all rise together. People in food deserts pay even more because they lack access to cheaper supermarkets. These are not marginal details, they are the real distribution of pain. And pain distributed unevenly becomes political instability. People do not revolt against averages, they react to lived experience. If their experience contradicts official optimism, they stop believing the officials. That is where the legitimacy crisis begins. You cannot govern effectively when the public believes the numbers are being used to hide reality. This is why war propaganda and economic propaganda often look similar. Both rely on selective facts, both highlight favorable indicators, both dismiss critics as alarmists, both delay accountability, both promise that victory or recovery is just around the corner, and both collapse when reality becomes too visible to deny. The Iran crisis threatens to make reality visible. If energy costs remain elevated, if food pressure continues, if real wages remain weak, if debt keeps rising, if delinquencies move higher, then no speech will hide it. People will know, they will feel it, they will connect the dots, even if the media tries not to. Now, let us be clear, not every economic problem in America comes from Iran. That would be simplistic. The United States already had serious structural issues: debt, inequality, housing costs, health costs, industrial hollowing, fragile supply chains, and political dysfunction. The Iran conflict did not create all of that, but it can accelerate it. Wars often do not create the weakness, they expose it. They put pressure on cracks that were already there. Then officials act shocked when the structure begins to bend. This is exactly why strategic restraint matters. A wise government does not enter military confrontations assuming the economy can absorb anything. It asks where the weak points are. It asks how energy disruption will affect inflation. It asks how households will absorb the shock. It asks what happens if the conflict lasts longer than expected. It asks whether allies can stabilize markets. It asks whether adversaries can exploit the economic pressure. It asks whether the domestic political system can sustain the cost. If those questions are not answered before escalation, then escalation becomes reckless. And here is the uncomfortable part. Adversaries understand American economic vulnerability. Iran understands energy markets. Russia understands commodity pressure. China understands supply chains. None of them need to defeat the U.S. military directly to impose costs. They can watch as Washington overextends itself, as energy prices rise, as domestic politics fracture, as the public loses patience, and as American leaders argue over who is to blame. That is strategic advantage without firing a shot at the American homeland. This is why the Iran war is a national security story. It is not just foreign policy. It is not just economics. It is the intersection of both. A nation's strength is not measured only by weapons. It is measured by industrial depth, economic resilience, public trust, fiscal capacity, and strategic judgment. If a government spends all of those recklessly, it weakens itself. The final warning is this: military escalation and economic fragility are a dangerous combination. When leaders launch or sustain conflicts without clear objectives, they often try to hide the cost. When they hide the cost, they delay correction. When they delay correction, the cost compounds. And when the cost finally becomes undeniable, the options are worse than they were at the beginning. If Washington continues to treat the Iran crisis as something that can be managed with military pressure and political talking points, it is making a serious mistake. If it continues to ignore the way energy shocks hit households, it is making a serious mistake. If it assumes the Federal Reserve can fix a war-driven supply problem, it is making a serious mistake. If it believes Americans will accept falling real wages, higher debt, and rising essentials while being told everything is under control, it is making a serious mistake. Bad policy does not become good policy because officials repeat it with confidence. A failed strategy does not become successful because the press uses careful language. Inflation does not become painless because economists average it across categories. And war does not become affordable because the government refuses to send the real bill. The bill is already being sent. It is being sent to drivers at the pump. It is being sent to families at the grocery store. It is being sent to workers whose wages no longer keep pace. It is being sent to households carrying more debt. It is being sent to communities that were already vulnerable before this crisis began. And if the policy does not change, the bill will grow. The United States does not need more slogans. It needs strategic discipline. It needs honest accounting. It needs leaders willing to admit that military action has economic consequences. It needs a foreign policy that understands energy, debt, industry, and household stability as part of national security. And it needs to stop pretending that the American people can endlessly absorb the cost of decisions made by officials who never pay the price themselves. That is the reality. The Iran war has exposed something bigger than an inflation report. It has exposed the weakness of a governing class that starts fires abroad and then acts surprised when smoke fills the house at home.